works, let's say. There's another issue that we can't contend with. And one of those might be, well, imagine that in order for society to progress, you have to allow the individual to compete in a relatively untrammeled space so that they can innovate. And then imagine that one of the consequences of that innovation is that you get these Pareto distributions developing because the innovator or the one who's second in line to the innovator, whatever, ends up with the bulk of the spoils. So you might say there's a cost to be paid in inequality for innovation. And then you could also say, well, too much inequality destabilizes things, which seems to be quite clear. So there's room for an intelligent conversation about that, right? Because the lefties say, too much inequality. And they need to be listened to because the evidence is quite clear. If you let the inequality ramp up enough, the whole system destabilizes because the people at the bottom think, fuck it, we'll just flip the system upside down.
Right.
No one wants that. Like right-wing conservatives don't want that. So because you could make a Republican argument and say, don't let the inequality in your neighborhood get out of hand because the crime rate will skyrocket. And the empirical evidence on that is overwhelmingly strong. Inequality drives crime. Now you can argue about why, but the fact that it does that's not disputable. So we could have an intelligent discussion between the left and the right, and the discussion would go something like this. You need innovation, you pay for innovation with inequality. But you need to bind inequality because if it's too intense, then things destabilize. It's like, okay, we could agree on that. We've got the parameters set. Now we have to start thinking very carefully through how to do the redistribution issue, and we don't know how to do that. So you might say, well, we have a guaranteed annual income for people, which I think is a horrible solution, by the way, but it addresses the right problem. The problem is that we're hyperproductive, but the spoils go to those at the top. And some of those resources need to be funneled down to the people who have zero so that they have an opportunity to at least get to the point where they can innovate, and so the whole bloody thing doesn't wobble and fall. And and I would say in some sense that's what the political discussion is about. But we've skittered off into these radical oversimplifications, which is something like, well, if you have more than another person, you're an oppressor and you're evil. And if you have less, it's because you're virtuous and victimized. And that's just a non-starter.
So you think that there's a real problem with like something like a universal basic income? You think it's a horrible idea?
Well, I think the idea that the solution is a basic income is not a good idea because I think the problem is deeper than that. I don't think the fundamental problem is that people don't have enough money. I think the fundamental problem is that human beings in some sense are beasts of burden. And if they're not provided with a place where they can accept social responsibility, social and individual responsibility in an honorable manner, they degenerate and die. That's the opiate crisis in the West right now. Like men who are men don't need money. They need function. And we've got a problem. One of the problems is, for example, here's an ugly stat. I think I told you this once before. It's illegal to induct anyone into the armed forces if they have an IQ of less than 83. And the reason for that is the armed forces, despite having every reason to draw the contradictory conclusion, has decided that there isn't a single thing that you can be trained to do in the military if you have an IQ of less than 83 that isn't positively counterproductive. That's 10% of the population. And we're producing a culture that's very cognitively complex. Like, what the hell are you going to do if you can't use a computer? Like, if you can use a computer, you're at least in the game. If you can really use one, you're hyper powerful. If you're not literate enough to use a computer, you're at zero. 10% of the population. The conservatives say, well, there's a job for everyone if they just worked hard enough. It's like, no, and increasingly no. And the liberals say, well, everyone's basically the same and you can train anyone to do anything. It's like, no, you can't.
Yeah. I want to go back to the inequality point here because if you look at this biologically, actually, I think it reveals a lot. Why are we know from careful study that people are motivated by the degree of inequality more than they are the absolute level of well-being that they have. And there's a very good, it's tragic, but a very good evolutionary reason for this, which is if you are working on some piece of land and your neighbor has the adjacent piece of land and they're doing twice as well as you, it's because they know something you don't. Right? And so becoming focused on what they're doing that you're not doing is a rational thing to spend your time on so you can figure out what it is that they know that you don't. In the modern environment, this is a catastrophe. Because who are your neighbors? Well, you've got some box sitting on the wall of your living room that has a totally artificial portrait of other people who may be much wealthier than you, and it's broadcasting in as if you're looking in their window, right, in the adjacent house. And so you think, you're being triggered to think that you're doing something wrong that you might fix, when in fact the solution may not be, first of all, the person on the other side of that screen may not be for real,
Right.
but even if they are, they're not living in the same environment as you. The technology is interfacing with our brains badly. But so we have the perception of massive inequality. Economically, we do have massive inequality. You're arguing that the solution to this involves some sort of massive redistribution.
Well, as solution. I wouldn't
A
argue,
solution.
but
Nonetheless, redistribution is wildly unpopular for various reasons. And so what we've got now is a situation, this is speculative, but what's really happening is that austerity is being used as a threat to keep people who would otherwise rebel against the inequality in line. And my fear about this is that this is exactly the conditions that are going to trigger that tribal population against population mayhem that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. That when people have the sense that the burst of growth that they were experiencing is now over, the natural response is to turn on those who are not as powerful and take their stuff. That this is a totally indefensible but nonetheless biological pattern of history. And that if we want to avoid that, we have to stop sending the signals that trigger us to imagine that we've just run to the limit of the opportunity that we had discovered, and it is now time to look and see who can't defend their position.
How are we sending these signals?
Well, by basically failing to provide enough well-being that people's perception of the inequality is reduced to a tolerable level.
That's the
you do
argument
the-
for universal basic income,
That's
right?
certainly a strong one, and
it's also a good argument for equality of opportunity, right? Because people are actually not as resentful about the success of others as you might expect. They're resentful about it if they feel that the game is fixed. But they're also willing to consider the game long term. So lots of people will say, look, like, I'm stuck at not 0, I'm stuck at 1. But my kids might make it to 4, and that's good enough. And that's been the American dream, right? And that's a really high power antidote to inequality. It's like, well, yeah, there's some inequality. We need it to keep the generative mechanism going, but the game is fair and you can play it too, and there's some reasonable probability that either you or someone you love will be successful. So so it has to be a straight game, and that's why ethics is so important to keep this landscape stable. People can't play crooked games, and the rich shouldn't be fixing the game if they want to hold on to their money. And the problem is that some of them, although not all, some of them are fixing the game. And no one's happy about that. And no wonder, and I guess that was evidenced to some degree by the 2008 collapse, because it seemed, and I'm just as uninformed as the next person, so I'm capable of commenting on this. It seems from the outside that the rich disproportionately benefited from the restabilization of the economic system. And people are not happy about that. And they shouldn't be happy about that, because it indicates that there's something fundamentally rotten about the game. So you could say, well, maybe people can tolerate necessary inequality if the game isn't rigged. And so that's why everybody has to act in a manner that indicates that the game isn't rigged. And that means they can't rig it. That's really what it means. So we're also being driven into this inequality corner by the postmodernists and the neo-Marxists, because they say, this is the pernicious thing. They say, well, the reason that some people have more than others is because every hierarchy is based on arbitrary power, and they're all oppressors. And the reason they have the money is because they stole it from you. And there's some truth in that, because there are some criminals. But when you get to the point where you fail to distinguish the productive people from the criminals, which is exactly what happened in the 1920s in the Soviet Union, you better bloody well watch out, because when you radically make things egalitarian, you're going to wipe out all your productive people, and then you're going to starve. And so that's one of the doom end scenarios that awaits us if this idiot process of polarization continues. And what I find reprehensible about the universities, and you're tangled up right up to your neck in this, is that the universities are actively agitating to produce people who believe that all inequality is due to oppression and power. And that's just, well, first of all, it's technically wrong. But it's
why
dangerous.
is that, though? You guys both operate in that system. So what?
Well, here's the problem. As far as I know, nobody has properly studied the question of what fraction of the economy is actually crooked, rent-seeking, right? Not productive. And I fear that the answer to that question is that it's an awful large fraction of the economy, not because of some conspiracy, but because opportunity is finite, but con games aren't. And so anybody who can find a mechanism for transferring wealth from somebody else for doing nothing finds that mechanism, and that thing is ever present. Whereas discovering the next big thing that's actually productive is, something that goes along and fits and starts. And so if we were, really, you've described it very well. We've got a battle between two caricatures of what's true, right? Either the market is wonderful and it's producing great stuff with very little corruption, or everything that makes people unequal is the result of corruption. Both of these things are wrong, right? Markets are marvelous engines for figuring out how to do something really well. They're brilliant at this, right? And so people who see that fall in love with it, understandably, because they're so good at it. But what they're terrible at is telling you what you should want or what you should do, right? If people tell markets, here's what we would like to accomplish, and then the markets tell us, well, how do we accomplish that best? That would be a very viable system that would not result in massive rent-seeking, resulting in everybody feeling that all of their misfortunes are the result of a rigged game, which is so massively rigged that when they check, they see, yes, that is actually to a large extent what we're suffering from. But they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so they want to throw out markets entirely, which, would be a terrible mistake.
You asked, Joe, why this has happened in the universities, and like that, I think it's one of these runaway positive feedback processes. The universities start to tilt hard to the left in the 60s, and that just went out of control. And now we're at the point where that's the dominant force. And why is probably another manifestation of one of these Pareto principles. It was like, well, at some point there's enough lefties hired so that the probability that they're only going to hire people equally as left or greater starts to reach 100%. And then you iterate that across a couple of generations and you get no conservatives, which is more or less the situation, say, in the humanities and most of the social sciences. And it sort of looks like a conspiracy, but it doesn't mean that anyone is actually planning it, although there are conscious attempts also to silence conservative voices, let's say. And then that's also driven by this postmodern ethos, neo-Marxist ethos, I would say, that says that all of the right, the moral right, is on the side of the left. And so it's the combination of those two things. There's more things. I often think comically that if you paid sociology professors 3 times as much, the probability that they would be anti-capitalist would decline precipitously. Like, I think a lot of it's driven because there's a lot of smart people in academia, and they're underpaid relative to their intelligence. So, and that doesn't make them happy. So they get bitter and resentful about that. And they think, well, there's these goddamn bankers who are hauling in $20 million a year. And here I am, hardly struggling, but here I am struggling comparatively. And that's the issue, is comparatively on $100,000 a year, $120,000 a year. I look at that and I think, well, whatever. It doesn't matter. But my colleagues are often angry with me because I do work with the business school. And I also have a business. I'm not anti-capitalist in the least. But it's just dumbfounding to me because they'll come up to me and say, well, are you so sure that you should be working with a business school? And I think, what bloody planet are you from to posit a question like that? All businessmen are evil. It's like, really? That's the level of your sophistication?
This is really an argument that's been presented to you, that businessmen are evil?
Well, they don't come out and say that, but they certainly question my motivations, for example, in forming ties with the business school.
Like, what do they say about it?
They say exactly that. They question my ethics about forming ties with the business school. So,
But they don't give you any reasons for...
you're supposed to. The reason's supposed to be self-evident, Joe.
Oh, okay.
You know,
well,
it's,
so let's give this argument its due. I mean, I don't buy this argument, but nonetheless, let's not caricature it.
yes, that's good.
In an absolutely free market, which is not what we have, but we have something that tends in that direction. In an absolutely free market, if you compete two individuals, one of whom is completely amoral, will embrace any opportunity if it makes a profit, no matter what it is, and the other individual has some limit to what they will do, well, then there's no question who wins. If we give this experiment a long enough period, the individual who will do anything will outcompete the individual with moral limits, because...
Doesn't it depend on what the game is, though? Because
No.
if people find out that you have no moral limits, then they're going to remove themselves from your market.
Unfortunately not. And
No?
here's the... I know it seems like that, and in any given round, that's true.
Okay.
But to the extent that what you're saying is, to the extent that people police their purchasing, and they will stop using Uber if Uber is ethically compromised, for
Right.
example. Well, then the point is, well, what's the game? The game is to figure out which things are being monitored and not do any of the unethical things that are being monitored, but to do all of the unethical things that aren't being monitored. And so the individual who is perceiving which things they can get away with has an advantage.
That's
And-
the psychopath advantage. Right?
Well, I don't even want to call it the psychopath advantage, right? What this is that a market will train you to do this if it is unregulated. And the best that the ethically restrained person can do is compete dead even. They have no way of getting ahead, because the person that is completely free, the amoral business actor, has the ability to do anything that the constrained actor has.
Doesn't this depend entirely upon what the battlefield is?
Not really. There's sort of one exception, and that exception is people who have done something that has suddenly put them in a powerful position, right? So,
Like tech people.
Right. Tech people who have skyrocketed as a result of having innovated the next big thing,
Right.
have not been through the markets training them to discover the landscape of what isn't being monitored that you can make a profit at.
That's one of the fascinating things about tech people in general, is that these gigantic tech corporations almost all lean left.
Well, the gigantic tech corporations lean left. That's true. On the other hand, I mean, I hate to say it, but think about how Google started, right? Don't be evil.
Right.
I think they actually meant that.
Right.
Right? And the thing is, don't be evil is what it sounds like when you haven't been trained by the market to have to do whatever you have to do to beat your competition. You've just come up with the great search engine and suddenly you're on top of the world. But over time, what happens? That entity is now exposed to competition from a bunch of other entities that increasingly will find an advantage in being freer to do ethically questionable stuff. And so what it does is it forces an entity like Google to evolve in the direction of amorality. So now don't
kind
be
of happened
evil.
with China and Google,
Yeah.
because Google wanted to expand into China, and so they had to make a deal with the devil, so to speak.
Right, and
They had to accept censorship.
they will find ways to rationalize everything, because to not rationalize that which their competitors can avail themselves of would be to perish. And
One
so,
of the issues was there was all sorts of fake Google going on, just like they have fake Apple stores in China. They don't have the same sort of copyright laws that we have, and you can essentially plagiarize anything you want.
And Brett, you also said that I shouldn't make a straw man of the anti-business argument of my peers, and there's another way that I shouldn't make a straw man of it. Like, despite the fact that I'm not anti-capitalist, I don't believe that every entity is a business either. And one of the things that has happened to universities that has actually, they've pathologized in a number of dimensions, but they've also pathologized along the business dimension as the administrators have become increasingly trained or drawn from the ranks of business managers, because a university is actually not a business. It's like a church isn't a business. There are organizations that aren't businesses that you can't just cram into the free market structure willy-nilly. And so my colleagues also object to the transformation of the university into a business entity run by profit-seeking MBAs, and they should object to that, because that's not what the institution is for. So there are reasons for them to be skeptical, say, of my association with the business school, that aren't merely a reflection of a simplistic anti-capitalist ideology.
Oh, there are lots of things that have no immunity to contact with the market. Right. What has happened to the university system is that markets have pushed it in all kinds of directions that are not healthy for the mission of the academy. And this is also true, journalism isn't well done in a market either, right? Journalism done in a market ends up telling you what you want to hear, not what you need to know.
Right.
So anyway, markets are wonderful, but there's certain things they shouldn't be allowed to touch, and there are certain things that they shouldn't do, like tell us what to want. Right? There's no magic principle by which a market knows what's healthy and what you might crave
and
but
so
shouldn't have.
Well, that also then brings us back to another part of the conservative, liberal left dilemma, which is to direct the market means to impose the heavy hand of the state and its potential pathologies on the market, but to leave it alone completely means that it wanders randomly through an indeterminate landscape, and I guess part of the issue there too is it's sort of like, well, how do we properly balance foresight and planning, which you'd think would have some role in the construction of large scale states? It's like, well, what do we want the landscape to look like? How do we balance that with the sort of comprehensive computations that the market allows? And of course, the answer to that is we have political discussions about it all the time that are untrammeled, so that we can adjust the ratio between those two things as necessary. So again, that's a argument on the side of free speech. Right?
Yeah, I mean, really, it couldn't be more important. The real answer is that both failures are frightening.
Right.
Right? You really don't want a state nannying you and over-regulating the market and taking the magic out of it. And you don't want the completely unregulated landscape where the market, starts probing the minds of your children and figuring out how to sell them things that they don't have any ability to resist, right? You need to figure out what that path is. And it's not easy, but you can't do it in a landscape where you can't talk about the question.